During World War II, millions of wounded soldiers were captured and survived, but sometimes a wounded man who had surrendered was simply shot. Why did trained armies commit such an illegal act? To understand this, we need to look at how war breaks down rules, fear, and humanity itself. During the Second World War, there were a number of accounts of captured or wounded soldiers sometimes being shot and dealt with ruthlessly rather than receiving the care and attention that they needed. This was more common on the Eastern Front, but the shooting of a wounded or captured soldier was a clear war crime and violation of the laws and rules of war. These killings did not happen everywhere or all the time. Millions of prisoners of war were taken and survived the war, but when quick shootings did take place, they usually resulted from a grim mixture of fear, brutality, logistics, ideology, and also battlefield chaos. These are the dark reasons why captured injured soldiers were shot. The rules of war were very well established before the Second World War. The 1929 Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war were given humane treatment. Medical care was given for wounded captives, and there was protection against execution or abuse for them. Of course, if we think of the fates of those who fell into the hands of, let's say, the Japanese during the Second World War, they were certainly not given the correct treatment and were starved close to death and were treated with complete barbarism. Also on the Eastern Front, Hitler and his generals had given specific orders for their forces to execute and shoot political commissars, female Soviet soldiers, and resistance fighters without any questions asked, immediately on the spot. But shooting wounded or captured soldiers was illegal, no matter the circumstances. And yet these rules were often ignored when pressure mounted. The fierce combat conditions where soldiers often acted on panic rather than law made war crimes more likely to be carried out.
Gentlemen, we
Attacks
must address
happened
the
fast
economic
and without
implications
clear front
thoroughly.
lines.
Agreed.
And wounded
The data
enemies could
supports a
still
phased
have weapons
approach.
or grenades. Soldiers feared ambush or feint injury, and also some feint surrender. And the guarding of prisoners during combat slowed unit movement down and made the soldier taking the prisoners actually more vulnerable and also massively more noticeable. It was harder for them to conceal themselves, for example. One common battlefield reasoning was for soldiers that they claimed, "We can't watch prisoners whilst under fire," and soldiers often lacked manpower to escort wounded captives safely to the rear. In some moments of terror or exhaustion, killing was chosen over guarding. On fast-moving fronts, especially in retreats, encirclements, or amphibious landings, wounded enemy prisoners were seen as liabilities. They needed escorts and required medical care, and they also slowed down very mobile units during retreats or breakthroughs. Some troops believed they had no practical way of dealing with these prisoners and just shot them rather than abandoning them. And they knew if they just left them there, then they would probably later rejoin their enemy forces. Now, after many years of propaganda and brutal fighting, many soldiers began to see the enemy as subhuman and criminal, and they also personally found them responsible for civilian deaths and suffering. There was particularly intense hatred that existed between German forces and Soviet troops. For example, after Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union was launched. The Germans committed scores of atrocities inside of the lands in the east. And the Soviets, when they pushed the Germans back years later, well, they took no prisoners and instead even shot injured German soldiers right on the battlefields. Also, the Japanese often shot and killed Allied soldiers who they captured, as there was an intense and immense hatred they had for their enemy. The hatred produced a climate where mercy was seen as weakness. The German propaganda portrayed the Red Army in particular and their soldiers as hordes and Soviet propaganda emphasized the German atrocities. Now, this complete cycle created battlefield environments where prisoners were no longer viewed as human beings at all. As mentioned, some armies issued direct or implied orders encouraging brutality against the enemy. Nazi Germany was the clearest example of this. For example, in 1941, issuing the Commissar Order, instructing German troops to execute Soviet political officers on capture. Hitler also repeatedly described these as a war and officers tolerated or encouraged shooting of wounded Soviets. Even when not directly ordered, unit culture often assumed prisoners didn't need to be taken, especially when injured and incapacitated enemies were considered burdens. Once one side committed atrocities, soldiers feared being treated the same way if captured. They believed that they wouldn't spare us, so why should we spare them? Many German and Soviet troops believed capture meant death or torture, and that encouraged a preemptive brutality and a breach of the rules of war. Now, battlefield executions often followed the discovery of slain and slaughtered civilians, seeing mutilated or executed comrades, and finding wounded soldiers murdered. Then they would take revenge of their own, and soldiers reacted emotionally with absolutely no mercy. Revenge killings became a tit-for-tat in a tragic spiral that escalated the brutality on all sides of the war. There was also, though, a logistics reason why prisoners were at times not taken. Medical evacuations and prisoner handling required time and discipline that frontline soldiers didn't always have. Wounded enemies, especially those who were screaming, bleeding heavily, or were unable to move, were sometimes viewed not as human casualties, but as disposable problems, blocking movements. This mindset turned shootings and war crimes into perceived efficiency measures. But there was also a huge breakdown of military discipline, especially in the final months of the Second World War. Most World War II armies were conscripted forces with young soldiers who had minimal training in handling prisons of war, and also crumbling commands during defeats led to a hole in officers who could give specific orders. Once discipline faltered, war crimes increased sharply. Soldiers stopped seeing rules as relevant, and the killing of prisoners became shockingly normalized. After World War II, there would be some soldiers who were brought to trial for their role in executing prisoners of war. Charges were typically war crimes or crimes against humanity, but the majority of the perpetrators were never caught, and the deaths were just put down to, sadly, the chaos of the battlefield. But were these killings normal in World War II? Was it normal for armies to shoot injured, captured enemy soldiers? Well, the answer really is no. The majority of wounded soldiers were captured and treated properly, and millions of prisoners of war survived the war. Captured, injured soldiers were executed mainly, sadly, on the Eastern Front in the battles between the Axis and the Soviet Red Army. This happened because of an immediate battlefield fear, a lack of manpower to guard prisoners, the logistics in handling soldiers, and also for revenge. But these killings were never legally justified. But the psychology and terror of the front line of the Second World War allowed the killings to happen anyway. It was a war crime, and it was murder, killing a prisoner of war. Thanks for watching this video. If you do have a suggestion for a future video, comment below. And I hope you're enjoying this new series. If you have a suggestion for a future video, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.